everyone, and welcome to the Categorically Romance podcast. My name is Bree, and today I am so excited for the guest that is joining me. We have author Isabel Cañas joining us. Isabel, thank you so much for being here.
Bree, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this and I'm so excited.
Thank you. I am fangirling, but I'm trying to keep it at a minimum. So, let's start here. Tell me how 2023 has been for you.
Uh, this is a wild ride, let me tell you, because you don't even understand the Pandora's box you just opened. In January 1st, I think it was January 2nd, I was in Seattle for a long weekend, and my husband and I saw a house that we wanted to rent. And we had found out that I was pregnant a few months before that. And so we were like, do you know what? Now is the right time to move from New York City to Seattle to be closer to his family who are on Vancouver Island. So that's how January kicked off this year. We moved February, like the first week of February. Our stuff took like a month to get to our place. So I was in this like cavernous, empty house.
Oh my gosh,
I got a dog
across
and
the country.
across the country to a city where I've never lived before, but I do happen to have a lot of friends, so that's actually quite nice. In March, I got a dog, which was wild because I was 7 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant, and then in April I had a baby.
Oh
Uh,
my gosh.
so that's and then we're here. Like there was a magic time warp, and in between April and now, it's just been a blur of, having a newborn. This is my first kid. I don't know what I'm doing. And having family in town, family leaving, my husband going back to work, me trying to write. I'm like on maternity leave, aggressive air quotes, because I have this book coming out. And getting new projects off the ground is something that I like being on air quotes leave
Mhm.
ideally should not be doing, but I can't not write. So
Yeah.
here we are. It's been a whirlwind. It's like the
Ne
teacups ride to Disneyland, but it's just been going faster and faster and faster and faster. And I'm like, stop the car. I need to throw up, guys. It's just been crazy.
Well, I will tell you as I have 3,
Mhm.
and I have a almost 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 7-year-old. You will always be winging it, so just have fun, enjoy every moment of the chaos, and just know that, like, the winging it never stops. But, I'm glad that you are writing 'cause I think especially with your first, you're just, like, in it so hard because it's, like, your
Dude,
first,
it
but,
is
like,
so
you gotta have
intense.
those mom moments. You gotta have that mom time. So I'm glad you're still doing
Yeah.
something for
I think
yourself.
I was really worried about losing my identity as an artist when I stepped into motherhood, because I've seen women of my mother's generation and my mother kind of like lose themselves a bit. And I am very protective of my identity as an artist. And so I was very scared about that, but I'm good. I feel great.
Yeah.
I feel like the last month in particular, I've really felt like myself. And I've been writing and I have so much in the works that I'm not allowed to talk about. So let's talk about the book I can talk about,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Okay, you write some really cool books. We'll start there.
Thank you.
We'll transition to there. But I have to know. So give
Mhm.
us like your reading journey cuz like I want to know how we got to these really cool books that we are getting from you. So like what did you read it as a kid? Like what was your first love of reading?
This is a
Is it the
good question.
same? Is it not? Like tell us all the details of like Isabel's life as a reader.
Brie, I love this question. Okay, so I the first book I really fell in love with as a kid, I was about 9 years old and I was homeschooled and we were in this like homeschool book club and my mom was like nag nag nag, you got to read the book. Tomorrow's book club, you got to read the book. And I was like, okay, fine. It was called Mara, Daughter of the Nile by Eloise Jarvis McGraw, and it's a historical thriller romance, but for kids. But it's definitely got like a thriller palace intrigue aspect to it, set in ancient Egypt. And the main character, Mara, is a slave who ends up. She's bilingual. She speaks Babylonian and Egyptian, and she ends up in court, double crossing both her owner and, the guy she falls in love with who is, like, working on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, politically, and it was the first book that I had read that had a bilingual main character, and even though it was, like, written by a white woman, it's, like, set in ancient Egypt, it's, like, nowhere near my experience. To me as a little nine-year-old who had, like, lived in Mexico as a kid, come back to the US, like, kind of struggled with that transition a little bit in terms of language specifically because I learned how to read and write in Spanish. And I moved back to the US and everybody was like, okay, whatever, you read with an accent. We're going to tease you. Like, it was one of those things where I felt so empowered by this book and I'm still obsessed with it. Like, I reread it every once in a while. When I was a teenager, I reread it when I was sick. So it was like my special sick day book. I loved it, and I just, like, was obsessed with it, so it was, like, an empowering bilingual main character who was, like, a badass, and she got the hot guy in the end, and it was great. Plus I was obsessed with ancient Egypt. I think I have always had a fascination with the past. So when I was a kid, I went hard on ancient Egypt, like, so hard.
It's
Like,
hard not to, right?
it's
Like,
hard
it's
not to.
hard
It's
not to.
shiny, it's intriguing, their mysteries, their tombs. It's like
Where
9
is Cleopatra? Like, we wanna know.
Oh, and Hatshepsut, like, the
Where
woman
is
who
Hatshepsut? Yeah, where did all of
Right!
her stuff go?
Where did
Yeah.
all this stuff go? And there's so much intrigue, there's so many periods, it's like the best 11 like, 9 to 11-year-old play box that has ever existed on Earth.
Don't
So
get me
I
started on King Tut. Like, don't get me
Yes!
started on
And
little
Ramesses
King
the 2nd.
Tut. Yeah.
Just I need to bring in the nerdiness, but, like, I remember when I was, like, 8 or 9, I told my mom, like, "I need to learn Arabic because I wanna become an Egyptologist," and they do digs in Egypt where they speak Arabic now. And my mom points to that because I got my undergrad degree in Arabic and my master's in Arabic, Arabic Lit, and then I did
Yeah.
a PhD in Islamic studies. So, like, that's kind of where it all started. But to rewind back to reading, I was really interested in historical fiction. Another book that, like, wrecked me when I was about 14 and probably too young for this book, maybe 13, was Gwendolyn Brooks's Year of Wonders, which was about the Black Plague. And it's about this young woman, who was, like, kind of a servant in a house in a town called what was it called? It was like it's one syllable. Like, it's not Ely, it's a town in England, like this little town that during a plague in the 17th century, decided to enforce an intense curfew and cut itself off from the world to stop the plague from spreading. And
Mhm.
so it becomes kind of like this locked house mystery where it's or kind of like it has a very thriller aspect to it because it's like the roads are closed, no one's going in or out, you're trapped and there's a plague. And there's this like romance between the young woman and like the dad of the house, which looking back is like, age gappy and questionable. But like it just, I don't know. I think so now thinking back, I'm like looking at this trajectory in my early teens and like as a kid and I'm like, ooh, history, like some kind of thrilling aspect, like intrigue or we're trapped, or it's kind of making sense. But I think, like, the next step would be my deep dive into the Gothic, which began with Dracula when I was no, actually it began before then. I think in I think when I was a junior in high school, we had to read House of Seven Gables and Poe, and we did, like, a section on the Gothic. And one of my English teacher assigned us uh, she told us to write a short story that was, like, inspired by the Gothic, and so I wrote this, like, unreliable narrator short story, and I remember I showed it to my mom, and she literally gasped at the twist at the end, and it was, like, the biggest hit I have ever received. I was like, "Wow, the power. This is the best." But we read House of Seven Gables, and then I just kind of kept going, and I remember reading Dracula under the desk in AP US History that year. When I was a first year in university at the University of St. Andrews, I took an English lit class, and among all the dead white guys and the Brontes, we read Toni Morrison's Beloved when I was
Mm.
19, and that absolutely shattered my understanding of what literature and specifically the Gothic could be, and, like, looking back, I think it was, like, a deeply formative reading experience for me, and when it comes to, like, assigned reading in classes, like, I did a lot of, like, area studies when I was in university because in the UK, you don't take, like, general education classes, you just focus on your degree. In Scotland specifically, you have a teeny bit of leeway, which is why I took a semester of English and then failed a semester of econ. But yeah, it really or the way she writes. Oh my god, I reread it recently, and I just on a nitty gritty sentence level, I worship at the throne of Toni Morrison because there's nothing like the way she spins a sentence or the way she does character. She's incredible.
Wow.
And yeah, and then around the same time, I think I had read The House of the Spirits when I was a younger teen, but I had one summer in between my, I think, 3rd and 4th years of university where I was intensely lonely.
Mhm.
Um, I had not gone home for Christmas. I'd been studying abroad in Egypt. I bounced all over the Middle East. I went back to the UK for university, and I was just fiercely lonely and did not feel like myself. I was in a sad place, and I reread The House of the Spirits, and I'm choking up right now because it felt like coming home. It's such
Yeah.
a powerful book. I love Isabel Allende, but and I love her later work, but I really think that The House of the Spirits is it channels something really powerful. And I think having read her memoir, Paula, and where she describes the process of writing The House of the Spirits, I think she was kind of aware that she was channeling something almost beyond herself when she was telling her
Yeah, more than her,
story.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I chase that in my writing. I try and be that in my writing because I know as a reader, as specifically as a Latina reader, there is something so transcendent about coming across a work of literature like that that just speaks to you so intimately. Oh, a
Like,
great
she
book.
wrote this for me. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, literally, it felt like she was reaching across time to, like, put her hand on my shoulder and say, "It's okay, you know? Your
Wow,
family's like
yeah.
my family, and I'm still here, so you're gonna get through this."
So you had these, like, aspirations, you were gonna be an Egyptologist and all of these things. When did the writing happen? I mean, you did that assignment and your mom read it and she gasped and it's like, okay, like, were those, like, early seeds being planted? Was it always in the back of your mind? Like, when did the writing bug
Those
when
early
did it
seeds
hit?
were I think I remember I have my sisters say I have a creepy memory, but I remember before I was old enough to write, so probably when I was about 4, before I knew how to write, I remember dictating stories to my older sister
Oh, I
to
love
make
it.
her write them down. I come from a
To have
family of
her write them. Yes.
yeah, like, that's what older sisters are for, right? You boss them
Yeah.
around. No, she definitely did the majority of the bossing, but in this case, I asked her to write down stories, like, I would draw a picture, and then I would dictate the story, and she would write it down. Um, I come from a family of storytellers. My mom was a journalist, there aren't a lot of writers in my family, there are a lot of artists, especially on the Cañas side of the family, there's a lot of, fine arts, business going on there, and a lot of creativity, but there's like, my family is intensely funny, and I think that's because we prize being able to make each other laugh, and how do we do that? By spinning stories and, like, having and so, like, our dinner time conversations are so raucous. Like, when my family gets together, like,
It's a
at
good time.
Thanksgiving it's a great time. Like, for example, at Thanksgiving this past year, my sis I'm one of 5 kids, so all the siblings got together, bar 1 who has 3 kids and was too busy, which is tragic, but so the 4 of us got together, and then one of my cousins from my mom's side of the family was there, and we were at the house of my uncle from my dad's side, um, and it was so funny because the 5 of us got together and we're laughing and talking and telling stories and making each other laugh, and, like, slowly, like, one husband left the room, then another husband left the room, and then my older sister's Apple Watch dinged because it was like, "Be careful, the decibel level in this room might be damaging to your ears," because we
Aw.
were just laughing so much. So, I come from a family of storytellers, and, the writing bug bit me when I was young. I didn't start writing I think I wrote a lot of fan fiction. Let's start there. When I was like 14, 15, like embarrassingly too old, I wrote a lot of Lord of the Rings fan fiction
Okay, I
and
needed to
I
know
started
what
writing
fandom, okay.
yeah, exactly. It's specific. Like, what kind of nerd are you? What kind of fan fiction did you write? Lord of the Rings. I was off the deep end. Because I had this theory, having read the books, before the movies came out and Legolas was blonde. Legolas is a Sylvan elf. He's from
Mhm.
Mirkwood. In the text, they're described as having dark hair. And I was like, I have found the Mexicans in Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings. They have dark hair like me. I'm so desperate for any representation in fiction that I
I feel
like.
like, yeah, when it's people of color, when we're reading something or consuming something, we're just looking for that little clue that it's like,
Totally.
"Okay, you're one
I
of
would
us."
go get any brunette I clung to for
Yeah.
dear life, you know? Because there was so little when I was growing up. And I read Holly Black's Tithe and started writing fiction that was very derivative of that. In college, I stopped. I took a creative writing class when in between, I think it was junior and senior year of high school at Brown University. I had the privilege of studying there at nerd camp. And I was in this class with like, ooh, scary college kids. And they were all writing very, capital V, very serious literary fiction. And I was like, hello, I write fantasy. And it was me and this other kid. So we were the only two kids, or two young women. We were 17, the only two people of color in the class.
Yeah.
And she wrote romance and I wrote fantasy. And the instructor in this class was so uncharitable to us. Like, I came out of that experience crushed.
Yeah.
I had been
Devastated.
told. Yeah, and, I was 17, I was in this literary creative writing seminar with college kids. I was, so excited to finally be in a grown-up writing class, and this instructor was very hoity-toity, very on her high horse, very anti-genre, which I think a lot of people in MFA programs or creative writing programs in college, encounter in the US. It was a little devastating, so I didn't write fiction all through college because I'd been told, I was bad at it. And so I wrote poetry and I journaled like a crazy person because I can't stop writing. So I just kind of switched genres a little bit. And I wrote my first novel in the first year of my PhD program. My husband had been my then boyfriend, now husband, was really encouraging in terms of me writing fiction. So I slowly began to tip my toes back into it. And I wrote my first novel in 2016. And he still gives me grief about it because he wants me to rewrite it. And I'm like, nah, it's trash. And he's like, no, it's not. I will die on this hill. So
So
that's
is
kind of
there
what that's.
ever a chance of you, like,
Yeah.
pulling it out from under the bed?
One day, that YA fantasy was kind of a Beauty and the Beast retelling that spun off in its own direction. Very influenced now, I understand, looking back, by Tamara Pierce, because I was a big Tamara Pierce reader when I was a kid. We missed that piece of the puzzle when we were talking about books. I really loved the Alana quartet. The
Yeah.
what were they called? Yeah, um, female knights kicking ass, having frank conversations about birth control with their boyfriends, blew my little 13-year-old mind. And consent. I was like, this is ahead of its time. There's one book in the series that's not great when it comes to clearly inspired by Arab people in the desert, blah, blah, blah. It's a bit yucky, but the rest of it was very ahead of its time. So dip, those books basically undid my entire Catholic upbringing. In terms of
Yeah.
reorienting my North Star, I was like, screw the years of catechism. Tamara Pierce has shown me the way.
So was, like, doing your Arabic studies and, and traveling, was it everything you dreamed of? Like, I've been to, the city of Riyadh in
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia, and it's like, I think it's just the most beautiful. I feel like desert cities they deserve way more praise than they get. It was gorgeous over there, but, like, that's the only place that I've gotten to. So, like, I'm living vicariously through you, like, how was it actually getting, to do the studies and go to Egypt? How was it?
It was really cool. I had the opportunity to study abroad in Egypt as an Arabic major in 2011 and 2012. So the Arab Spring had just kicked off in January of 2011. I touched down in August of 2011 and I stayed there for about a year. And it was there were a lot of highs and a lot of lows. I think living
Mhm.
in Cairo specifically as a woman is very difficult, and I wasn't prepared for it. I think 2 years before that, I'd spent a summer in Istanbul, which is studying Turkish, which is a very European city. It is one of my favorite cities in the world. I will I want some of my ashes to be scattered in the Bosphorus. I love the city to pieces. And so I walked into Cairo thinking, "Oh, this will be just like Istanbul." Reader, it is not.
Yeah,
It is chaos, and it is known even throughout the Arab world for being really bad for sexual harassment. So, you walk in the streets as a woman and you are constantly harassed. It doesn't matter what you're wearing. You could be in full niqab, you could be in shorts and a t-shirt. I certainly never was because of said harassment, but like it kind of didn't matter, like foreign or Egyptian. It was it was constant. So
different
that was a big
experience, yeah.
blow,
Yeah,
in terms of living there, but I think it living in other countries as a young person is a privilege, but I think it should be made accessible because it teaches you so much about yourself, about, the influence of the United States and Britain in the world, and they're very shitty histories. And it teaches you a lot about your own culture as well as the culture you're learning to fit into. And it was a very powerful experience, and it caused me to become, I think, very reflective of myself and my place in the world. Because as a Latina, like abroad at a UK school, like just surrounded by the University of St. Andrews is very international. But the cohort of students going to study abroad in Egypt was, with one exception, myself and a Japanese British woman, very white. And so our experiences varied drastically from the white study abroad students because I would walk into a space and because of the color of my hair and my complexion and my features, people assumed I was Arab, which was quite nice. I mean, I had like a million conversations where people were like, "So you're Lebanese, right?" "Well, no, your dad has to be Arab." Like, "No, you're definitely Palestinian." And I'd be like, "Psych, no, my mom is Mexican, my dad is white. Like, this is the face you get. I guess it's just kind of Mediterranean, guys." Like, but, so that was very interesting because I had a very different experience to some of my fellow students who were white and, male. Had a
yeah.
very different experience to the male students. But I lived in Egypt. I lived in Palestine briefly. I lived in Jordan in 2014, which was also a really interesting experience. Like you said about desert cities, like I spent a long weekend in Wadi Rum, and it was transcendent. Like the beauty of those landscapes has been written about 1,000 times, but it never it never measures up. Like I never really understood how icky light pollution is until I was there, like sleeping under the stars in Wadi Rum, and the stars feel, like, so close, you could just pluck them out of the sky. Like, it was absolutely gorgeous. I didn't love living in Jordan because Amman, the city I was in, is, like, it's kind of like it's not strip mall-y, but, like, imagine, like, an Arizona or Southern California, like, beigey strip mall-y kinda town. Like, it kinda has
Oh,
that vibe a
okay.
little
Okay.
bit.
Yeah.
It's weirdly expensive. Like, the Jordanian pound at the time was, like the exchange rate with the British pound and the amount of money I had in my life, very little, made it a little stressful, but and there was the conflict in Syria was ongoing at the time, so there were a ton of refugees, there was a lot of political discourse about refugees. It was a difficult time, I think, to be living in the Arab world. As a foreigner, yeah, I think for anyone especially. But I also I've spent a lot of time in Turkey. My PhD is in Ottoman studies specifically. I did 14th century Turkish literature. Very niche, very nerdy, and I
I
absolutely
love it. I
love
was wondering what your PhD was in.
Mhm.
Okay. This
That's
makes
how
so much sense.
Yeah, the pieces are fitting together. Yes, I've spent a lot of time in Turkey, and Istanbul is, like I said, one of my heart places. There's something about being suspended on a ferry going from one side of the city to the other and knowing you're in between 2 continents that makes you feel like you're in the center of the world. And it was the center of the world for millennia. So, as Byzantium, Constantinople, and then as the Ottoman capital, it's a nexus, and it has the kind of energy that nexus cities have, like London or New York City, where it feels like a country unto itself because it's so diverse and it has so many limbs and experiences that happen in in that space. So it's a very special city. I absolutely adore it. So yeah, spent a lot of time studying there, and it was everything I wanted it to be in Istanbul specifically. Except for the summer, there was an attempted military coup. That was a little scary. That was 2016. 2016 was a rough year all around, and for me, it started with the attempted military coup, and then there was Brexit, and then there was Trump. It was a rough year, but like longest night of my life, longest night of my life.
Well, like I said, you write some really cool books, okay? So, we got the hacienda.
Mm.
It took over everything. Like, I couldn't scroll Instagram without seeing it. It was all over YouTube. Like, how how did that feel for you? Did you when did it hit you that like, "Oh, shoot, I wrote this and people love it?"
It was weird. There was kind of like a delayed reaction. I was defended my PhD the day before the book came out,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so yeah, I the universe was pretty unsubtle about like closing chapters and opening new ones. I scheduled them like at least 3 weeks apart, and then because it was chosen as a Barnes and Noble Discovery pick, and then like my advisor's schedule changed, they ended up back to back, and I was like, "Are you friggin' serious?" Like, so I had an enormous amount of anxiety about my PhD defense leading up to my book release. So I wasn't really thinking about it a whole lot, which I think is good. And now I have a baby leading up to this book release, so I don't think about it as much, which is good, I think. 'Cause as authors, there really is only so much we can control. A lot of it, like a lot of like, ah, the publisher is the one who really makes the magic happen. Like, you can have a bajillion I mean, maybe if you have a bajillion followers on TikTok, that changes the equation, but, like, I do not. And so I figured, like, well, there's only so much anxiety can do, so may as well be anxious about something else. For me, it was walking into bookstores and seeing it on shelves, like walking into Barnes& and Noble, walking into my local indie at the time was, Books Are Magic in Brooklyn. I it was this weird out of body experience.
Like, I did that.
I
That's me.
think yeah. Yeah, it's weird. I think the thing that really drove it home was my husband listening to it on audiobook.
Oh my
'Cause you can look
gosh.
at the written word and be like, "Oh, it's there in the world for people to read. Ew, like, how dare you perceive me? I'm a Scorpio, I'm deeply private." I'm like, "No, thank you, don't look at
Same.
me."
Oh, yeah.
You
Don't mess
also
with
yeah, I just yeah. But he downloaded the audiobook and he was like, "Oh, I haven't reread it since before you did copy edits, so I'm gonna listen to it again." Bless him. I love him. He's so supportive. But he would listen to it out loud. So I would like walk into the kitchen while he was cooking and there would be these actors performing words that I wrote. And because it's somebody else's voice reading and performing the words, there were times where I'd walk into the room and it didn't register that it was my words. It just kind of sounded like an audiobook. It sounded like a story being told. And then like a beat, and then it would click. Like, holy shit, that's my book. I wrote those words. And it made me want to like dive under the covers and never be perceived ever again. The audiobook is the short answer. TLDR, the audiobook. Whew, that hit home.
Wow. Well, you shared earlier that you wrote the story that your husband is still like, "You should pull this out and do something with
Yes.
it." Like, tell me, okay, how did we go from there to all the traveling you've done, all the studying you've been doing? How do we get published? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I began by writing YA fantasy. I think as many authors a lot of authors did. A lot of authors in my cohort I know started writing YA fantasy and pivoted because the market kind of changed. So in 2017, I wrote that book that my husband really loves in 2016, and then instead of revising it because that was hard, I wrote another one. And I got into Pitch Wars with it. Pitch Wars is a now sadly departed pitch contest on Twitter where you enter your prize is you get mentorship for X many weeks and then a spot in like an agent showcase. And so I was mentored by two fantastic writers, Monica Bustamante and Kirby Addis, and they helped polish up my manuscript. And then I queried a bunch of agents with it. And I found my agent through Pitch Wars. Well, indirectly. Like I was querying people, and every time I got a rejection, I'd shoot out another query. My agent was not directly involved in Pitch Wars, but she saw it on the internet and had been like skulking and stalking me, and then when I queered her, it was like the day before Thanksgiving, she requested it within 24 hours. I was like, "Ooh, okay." And we hopped on the phone and discovered that we had excellent chemistry. Her name's Kari Sutherland. She's at KT Literary, and she is like
Shout out to
my guiding
Kari.
light. My
Yeah.
guiding light. She never gave up on me. So that was late 2017, I signed with her. We polished up my book, sent it out in submission, got a lot of rejections, trunked it. I wrote another book in 2018. We sent it out in submission, got a lot of rejections, revised it for an R&R. That took like 6, 7 months. And over the course of this, I was like proposing my dissertation, getting married, like lots of shit was
Life
happening.
things.
Yeah, and just getting rejection after rejection after rejection. My first book was not Mexican enough. My second book was too Mexican and had too many air quotes like long names because there was a lot of like the Aztec pantheon involved in it. Um,
I was
and
wondering,
then
like, because your books are so freaking good. I'm like, what do the rejections say? What are they
there
saying? Is it good feedback? Is there no feedback?
You know, this is a great question. Some of the feedback was like, this book does not like isn't like perfect, which it was not. I admit that. I've gone back and read it and I'm like, yeah, it's flawed for sure. But like
But that's what editors are there for, right? Like, to help you?
exactly. And that's what my agent was saying. She was so frustrated because she was like, yes, that is the point. You edit the book. But looking back and in conversations I've had with friends of mine who are white, it's like, there is more leeway given to white writers who have books on submission to turn in something like to submit or sell something that is flawed and like have it be polished up. Whereas for writers of color or writers of other marginalized identities, I think, at in the period when I think the submission world and the submission game has changed since the pandemic, it is different. It's harder, I think. But when I was trying to sell my first book and break in, I felt that there were higher standards for my work because of my name. And that
Like, the
was
expectation was that you turn in a perfect book.
something flawless,
Yeah.
and I was deeply frustrated by it, and so I remember that second book we revised it, I busted my ass revising it. I was on my honeymoon in Mexico City with my husband when I received a rejection on the R&R, um, and I was crushed, and I remember we're in the lobby of the Anthropology Museum, which was my favorite museum as a kid, so I dragged my husband there. I was like, "We're definitely doing this," even though there are no audio guides in English. And I'm just gonna it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great, trust me. And I sobbed in the lobby because I was like, I have done all I can. What am I gonna do now? And he is incredible. He gave me a pep talk, the get back in the saddle pep talk, and he was like, "Okay, you have 2 projects, kind of that you're, kind of tiptoeing around the edges of flirting with. Which do you think you should do? There's like an adult fantasy or there's this horror project that you were thinking about, this haunted house one. You should get back and start writing one of them." And I was like, okay, I think I need to pivot away from fantasy. And I started writing The Hacienda a few nights later because I woke up in the middle of the night and like the first words of the book started coming to me in the middle of the night. It was wild. I snatched my phone off the nightstand and started typing as fast as I could because I heard Andreas's voice. Like, it hit me so hard. It was like the first chapter all in one piece in my head there with the voice. And for me, I'm a very voice-driven writer. I can have the whole thing plotted out, but I struggle to begin until I found the right voice, and it hit me. And I'm very type A, see above like plotting, 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 when it comes to my books. And so, but once I had that voice, I was like, I have to start. I had a very incomplete outline. I hadn't done all the historical research. It was my first attempt at historical fiction. It was my first novel length attempt at horror, but I was like, I have the voice. I have to start. And I did. And it became what it was.
I love that this happened, like, in the middle of the night, because it kinda just seems like, um, you just had to let it come to you, not
Mhm.
to, like, diminish all the work that you had been putting in, but I totally can imagine, like, being heartbroken in that moment of, like, "Gosh, I've been busting my butt, and I'm being
Yeah.
told no," and then out of nowhere, it's just like you're and sleep is so important. Like even in Vampires of El Norte, which we're gonna get to, like Abuela, Abuela says to, I can't remember if it's to Nina or if it's to Nestor, but like how important not waking a person up, like startling
Yeah,
out of them out of
yeah.
their sleep is. So
Mhm.
imagining you like in your sleep and like the story just comes to you. I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's what you
Sleep is
needed.
a
You
huge
needed it to
part of
just
my
come to
life,
you.
like, I miss a solid 9 hours, like, it's so important to my creative process. Dreaming is a huge part of my creative process. I joke that I daydream for a living, and it's, like, not true. Yeah, I think the book my career came out of a lot of rejection, and I think that the way the hacienda came to me is also, how should I phrase this? The way the hacienda came to me, I think is proof of my belief that the muse will come to you, like the ancient Greek genius will come to you when you are working. And so when I'm not, like, air quotes, on maternity leave and juggling a 4-month-old child while my husband is working, um, I write every single morning, even if it's dribble, even if it's just brain dumping. I'm a firm believer in morning pages and just being at the keyboard, in this case, my Alpha Smart Neo, the love of my life. Um, because to me, I've always believed that the magic comes when you're already in the act working. That's when my best ideas come to me, is when I'm working, usually working on something else that I'm not
Yeah.
supposed to be working on. And then a good idea comes to me and I like to jump between projects, which is bad because it means I'm bad at finishing projects. But yeah, the Hacienda came to me because of a lot of rejection and because I was practicing a lot. I was doing my drills, I was writing, I was revising. And then I was like, well, I'm going to pivot. Really have no choice. If I want to get my career off the ground, I got to try something different.
Gotta
And,
try something different. Yeah.
yeah, my first book was too Mexican. Let's be demasiado Mexican. Let's be way too Mexican. Let's go hard.
We have the incredible Hacienda, which was fantastic. We have to tell me how your brain works. What were you doing in life that you come up with this concept that is Vampires of El Norte?
Oh
Because
my god.
I mean,
Great
like,
question.
supernatural Western, I'm like, we need a whole maybe there is a whole subgenre of this, but, like, I was like, "I need more of this."
Yeah.
What were you
I
doing that this came to you, Isabel?
I was, finishing my PhD and trying to escape it at every corner. I I had an idea for something that was, I guess, a bit of a sequel to the Hacienda, and my publisher was like, "Nah, no, thank you. We would like another standalone," which devastated me because I love Andres and Beatriz. They are very special to me, and I have thoughts and feelings about how their story continues. But I had this one side character called Nestor who had walked
Mhm.
into the book, like the idea for that book that is now scrapped, fully formed, with a very strong voice and a specific background coming from Texas, which is where my mother's family's from. And my editor, with her bird's eye view, pointed at him and was like, "That, his background, that's your family's background, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Why isn't the whole book about that?" And I was like, "Oh, duh." My editor at Berkeley is Jen Monroe, and I really like working with her. She's great. Um, but I started with that and I was like, "Oh, weird, writing close to home." Because my family history is not from the region that the Hacienda is set in. My mom grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, and she was born in a town called San Benito, or was raised in Harlingen. If that means anything to your listeners, they're near Brownsville. They
I
are
live in
very
San Antonio, so I'm like,
you
"Okay,
get it.
okay."
You get it. Yeah, they're the valley, like, very South Texas, and so, like, my mom's family's been there for generations, and my
Wow.
grandpa's from Tamaulipas, my grandma's mom was from Nuevo León, but her dad and, like, as far back as my mom has been able to trace, they've been in South Texas for many, many generations. Many. And so my mom has always been fascinated, and I think she wrote her master's thesis about how the border has moved around her family. And it's moved and shifted, but in 1848, at the end of the Mexican American War, it made this big jump from, I think, the Nueces River to the Rio Grande, where it just suddenly there were all these people living in South Texas in the 1840s who had been living there and ranching for, 100, 200 years, that suddenly found themselves the citizens of another country, a
Yeah.
hostile country, an invading country that spoke a different language and was rapacious in terms of its interest in their land. And so it was actually kind of difficult to research because a lot of the history is very, it's not one in which, in my mind, the good guys win. So it was tricky setting a book that is structurally a romance in this historical moment, because what happens to families like Nena's and Nestor's when the war is over? Eventually, they lose their land. Eventually, their ranches get broken up. Fences get put up. Their land gets stolen out from under them because of a lot of people's inability to read English and get tricked into signing contracts that they didn't understand. A lot of people were killed for their land. It's a very dark little bit of history in this pocket of the world. And so I was like, how do I write a romance set in this historical moment? How do I end it happily? It was kind of tricky. But I was also very influenced by my family when I was writing this book, not just because of their history, but their voices. Like, there's so much banter between Nena and Nestor, and like I said earlier, like, my family are big storytellers. Like, the first draft of this book had way more siblings for all the characters. There were just a lot more people because when I envision, like, a family for one of my characters, if the character is Mexican or Mexican American, like, there's a big cast. And I think there's only so much character weight that a novel as a specific form, Western form, can shoulder. Did this book originally have a large enough cast to make it a miniseries? Yup. Would I love to see that? Absolutely. Hollywood, call me when you're done striking, please.
Yes,
But
yes, we need this
yeah,
on
you
film.
have to change it, please, please, please. But yeah, the Western part of it, it didn't occur to me I didn't set out to write a supernatural Western, or I guess in like deep dark genre world, they call it like weird Western, because there is some weird Western stuff out there, and the joke is that that shit never sells. Like, it's too niche, you know? And it's like, psych, I sold a Western to a big five publisher.
Yeah.
Joke's on them. Um, I I just started kind of writing a story, that was set in the region that my family is from, and it just so happened to be that. And it just so happened to have, like, hot cowboys and a lot of horses to,
Yes,
like, feed
yes.
my inner horse girl child. And then the
So,
vampires came in.
yeah, tell it like, for anyone that's listening that, this is gonna come out very soon, but for anyone who has yet to get their hands on a copy, how do you describe it to them?
I pitch this as, I guess, cowboys versus vampires on the Mexican American border in South Texas. Their Vampires of El Norte is the story of two young people, Nena and Nestor, who are separated by a tragedy when they're children, their childhood sweethearts, separated by a tragedy for almost a decade and are thrown together again on the road to war in 1846. And they have to defend their home, this rancho, from threats, both human and supernatural. The supernatural, of course, being vampires, but not like human-esque vampires, like not the Dracula I was reading under the desk in history class in high school. These, I decided to go on a bit of a monstrous bender. This is a bit of a creature feature. There's some scary monsters that lurk in the night in this book. They're not going to get up on two legs and talk pretty to you like Edward Cullen or the guys from Vampire Diaries. They are, I'd say, of the same family as the chupacabra.
That's what I would
Maybe,
okay, I would
yeah,
look,
maybe. That's what
living
my
in
sister
San
said,
Antonio, I was like, "Is this a
you get
chupacabra?"
it. I Yeah, I was thinking El Cuco. I was thinking, like, I want something, like, monstrous. My husband was like, "You were watching too much Stranger Things, Isabel." I was like, "Well, you're not wrong." I
'Cause you,
definitely
like,
was.
described the gray skin and, like, they sometimes they're, like, on all fours or, like, they'll stand up from all fours, and I was like, "This is so cool." So, like, what inspired the idea to not go the expected vampire route? Because I think it was just so brilliant what you did.
Thank you. I think it was just kind of me being rebellious. I had an idea for something that's more of the traditional vampire, I guess you could say, based on Mexican folklore. In central Mexico, there's stories about Tlahuelpuchis, or blood-sucking witches, who are vampiric, and the folklore is fascinating. And I think there are some writers who are drawing on that, and I'm like, yes, 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 want to read it, want to read it. But I toyed with the idea for a bit, and I realized that because of all the things I wanted to juggle in the book, the Mexican American War, the romance between these two characters, the classism, the whole society that they live in, I needed a supernatural element that worked. Um, because I was in a writing workshop once and I had an instructor who was a bit of a bitch. I did not like them at all. But one thing they said to me when they were critiquing my work was like, you have to think about where and how hard you're making the reader work. And it stuck with me because I was like, based on the story you were critiquing, that's like a little bit racist. However, it is something to think about when you're writing in genre, a genre that has supernatural elements specifically, because there is only so much that the reader wants to be able to juggle. If you're
Mhm.
making them work hard to come to grips with the world, are you going to throw in three more political systems? Are you going to throw in another magic system? Are you going to throw in competing religious systems? The characters might get lost in all of that. I've read books where they kind of get lost in the noise, and I've been frustrated because they're very good books otherwise. But I'm like, I am very much a character driven reader and a character driven writer. And like plot is very important to me. My goal in life is to write books that you can't put down. That is like my single métier. Like no matter what I write, I want you to never be able to put it down. I want you to like spill food on the book, you can't put it down. Um,
You are very
but
successful so far, so y
Thank
you
you, that means the world to me, honestly. But character is a huge part of that for me because if you are super invested in what they're going through, you wanna find out what happens to them. So, I wanted to make sure the characters didn't get lost in the world, and I wanted to make sure that they were not I think just in terms of, like yeah, I don't know why I chose to make them the vampires so monstrous instead of the traditional route. It was just a feeling I had, an instinct. And my editor, was asking, kind of pushing like, "Well, is Nena gonna turn into a vampire?" When I was, like, talking about the book at the very beginning, and I was like, "No, that's not really what I'm going for." I want something it's just a feeling, I guess, an instinct. Like, I wanted more of, like, a cryptozoology bent, you listen to, like, lore podcasts and hear about, like, scary monsters, in the dark in, like, rural places. I was like, "That's kind of what I want." I want that kinda creep in this book. So I chased that vibe, so to speak, and ended up with these very monstrous little guys.
And I think that I think it is written very, very tight. Like everything that's in there is what needs to be in there. And like at no point do Nana or Nestor ever like get lost in what's going on. Even though you do at the same time have a lot going on, but it's all important stuff. Like I think obviously there's like a class difference between them, which I
Mhm.
think is such a big part of the conflict, and you never really forget that. There's a beautiful second chance romance. Oh my god. Just I
I was
mean,
so indulgent to write.
from the
Bring
moment he takes off and the moment where he 9 years later and, like, their eyes meet, you're like, "Oh my god," like, he they're back, they're back. And then and then but it's also I think it's a really beautiful, which is weird to say because we are talking about a book with monsters, but it's a
Yep.
beautiful book about grief, and I've honestly grief in especially, like, romances or just love stories in general, anything, tend to be some of my favorite, and in the book, no it's Abuela that breaks it down. She says, "To you,
Mhm.
Nena died. To her, you left. Those are 2 very different griefs." And so you understand, like, her frustration, you understand his confusion, like, they're physically back in the same place, but they're still both grieving
Miles.
this
Yeah.
long time that they've been separated from one another.
I'm having that out of body experience where I'm hearing you, like, talk about it, and I'm like, "Oh my god, you read it and you get it." Like, you get it. Like, one that line, that conversation that Nestor has with Abuela where he his abuela, where she, talks about grief like that, like, I remember sitting in my apartment writing that and thinking about that and talking about it with my husband, and now you've read it? My little mind is blown, like and you get it, you get
Yeah.
it. I think for me, I think second books they're monsters in their own right. They resist domestication. They Writing this book was the hardest book I've ever written. It is the one that has changed the most from original seed to finished product. Like with the Hacienda, it was one hard and fast draft and honestly just polishing from there on out. This one went through different iterations. It had different speculative elements. It had different casts of characters, and got I got I had terrible morning sickness when I was revising it. So it was really, and I was burnt out from my PhD. So it was physically a very demanding book to write for me. And to hear you talking about it and like get it,
Oh,
I'm not
yeah.
choking up. Don't perceive me right now.
No, like, I always look for those I feel like authors, y'all will give us these little Easter eggs of, like usually it's, like, one sentence for me personally that I'm like, "This is what it's about," and it's because 'cause I'm gonna be a 6th grade English teacher this year, and I just
Mhm.
wanna be like, "Find the Easter egg, there's always one, at least," and for me, when Abuela said that, I'm like, "That's what this is about."
That's the thesis of this book. You know, I hadn't thought I have little hairs on my arm are standing on end right now. I have goosebumps because you're right. That's a sentence that, I kind of just wrote, but it ended up being it shines light on one of the thematic underpinnings of this book because when I was writing it, I had a lot of grief about when I was researching this history and what has been done to people whose family histories are the same as mine and like obscured by history and obscured by time, like maybe even my ancestors dealt with this incredible tragedy that befell this culture and these people. It was hard to read about, and also like my grandparents are getting old, and
Mhm.
my grandma was diagnosed with dementia, and that's been really difficult on my it's been really hard on
That's
my
hard,
family.
yeah, yeah,
And, I had a wonderful opportunity to, like, just sit and talk with my grandparents, like, about my grandpa's childhood, about my grandma, her mom's story, and just, like, be with them in a quiet space and just listen to them talk, like, I don't know how many times in my life I'm gonna get that again. So I
yeah.
feel like, "Oh, no, I'm choking up." Can you tell I a very sleep-deprived young mother right now.
We get
I
emotional as mom, we become even more emotional.
Jesus, it's just waterworks every day of the week here.
Yeah,
But, I had a lot of grief and, I don't wanna, like, pre-mourn them because that's a bit much, but, like, I'm a sensitive artiste, and when I think about my family and my family history and my identity, it's very tied to them in particular, and so the
yeah,
idea of, change happening and, the grand march of time carrying them further and further away from me is really hard. So I think that seeped into the book as well because it's so influenced by, my family, their voices, and these two people in particular.
yeah. Oh gosh, well, just I mean, abuela, she's so respected, and, like, my maternal grandmother, she's the last living grandparent that I have, and she's been
Mhm.
really sick, and I just
I'm so
think every
sorry.
day, like you said, you don't wanna
No,
pre-mourn them, I'm like, "She's
seems like
still
expected,
here."
you know?
But I'm like, I just know that if God forbid, if anything ever happens to her, I just know I'm gonna have that feeling of like, that's the end of a whole era of my life, and
Yeah,
you're not ready for it, but like all the
cool.
stories, you're like, tell me everything,
Right.
I wanna know
Eat
everything.
everything. My grandpa would joke, like, my grandma, actually, she was like, "I can tell you're writing this down in your head." And I was like, "Yes." Of course I am. This stuff is gold, first of all, and also I never wanna be without it. Like, this is very selfish of me in some regard. Like, I wanna keep it for me.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then I turn around and other people read it too, but this is for the books I write are first and foremost for me. And
yeah,
I think, I was once asked, like, "Why did you blend so many genres in this book?" Because, Vampires of El Norte is a supernatural Western. It's historical, it's got war, it's got a bit of a road trip, and structurally, at its heart, straight up, it is a romance. There are horror elements for sure, and I think actually the romance aspect has thrown some horror readers off. I've gotten some reviews where they're like, "This was not scary enough. Also, what's with the kissing?" And I'm like, "What's with the kissing? Sir, that is the point." This is a
I
cheesy book.
have so I grew up reading mostly horror, and now I
Mhm.
mostly read romance, and I will die on the hill that I, for one, feel like they're a lot more similar than I think people want to give
Yes.
them believe that
Yes,
they are,
yes, yes,
and I don't
yes.
understand why we can't have more of the 2 in one story. I don't know.
Because the patriarchy, because horror historically has been a very white man's genre, and we're here to take it, make it ours, you know?
I mean,
Um,
there are like, horrific things happening in this book. But at the core of the story, like, yeah, that's all going on, and you have 2 people in love, which makes it even more scary because it's like, what if they
yeah.
don't end up together?
Yeah, the stakes are high, you know? They could get hurt, they could get eaten by the monsters, you know, or God forbid, their parents could keep them apart, you know?
Yeah.
I remember asking my grandma about El Cuco, I was like, "Tell me every spooky story you ever heard when you were growing up." And she was like, "Well, there was El Cuco, yeah, yeah, yeah." But, like, the thing my father would tell us to really scare us was like, "Your mother will hear about this." She was like, "Yeah, my mother was the scariest part." So I was like,
I love it.
yeah, and I was like, "Well, yeah, that checks out." Yeah, I think horror and romance are they're genres where affect is so at the forefront because you can have a very, very small story. Like if you were to pitch it, it's like, "Oh, 2 baristas fall in love," or I don't know, like an Ali Hazelwood book, 2 scientists fall in love. Like, how do you or a horror book? It's like, "Oh, there's something spooky in the house." How do you turn that into something that keeps a reader absolutely glued to the pages? It's powerful and difficult work actually because like we don't have like when you think of like rom-coms or horror movies, it's like what do those have? Those have musical cues. Those have the actors looking at each other. There's a lot of visual stuff going on. There's a lot of sound work happening to build tension and to keep the audience on the edge of their seat. But with the written word, it's like, what have you got? You've got black letters on a white page,
Mhm.
and it's all about how you control sent on like a very nitty gritty sentence level, how the writer is able to control the way the reader is feeling through sentences. And when you think about it, it's like that shit is witchcraft. It's very difficult, and I think horror and romance in particular hinge on the writer's ability to do that. And
Yeah.
I think it's a very powerful experience for a reader, and I think these 2 genres are the ones that people turn to for escapism for a reason. It's because romance writer and when you put them together, man, that is where the magic happens. The tricky thing about squishing romance and horror together is like, well, we're running for our lives, the house is trying to kill us, you know, there are monsters in the dark. Where do you fit in the kissing? It's like, okay, where are they gonna bone? This is like a very difficult problem structurally for me to handle. There was a point where I was, like, distraught telling my husband, like, "Oh, no, I have to cut a scene where they're finally gonna have sex. What are we gonna do? They're not gonna have sex in this book." And then, like, a week later, I was like, "I fixed it. I fixed it." Yeah.
And they're both so I'm such an emotional reader too, and I just feel like they're both even horror in its own way, horror readers, viewers don't come for me. I'm a horror fan, but I'm like, I even think of like some of my favorite horror movies, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. I'm
Mhm.
like, I empathized with that crazy family that was sending Leatherface out there to kill people. Like, you get it. Like, my
Mhm.
emotions are in it. So I'm like, they are so, but those are the only 2 genres that I feel like emotionally I get really invested in. And I'm like, they're so similar.
Yeah, and I think they appeal similarly to a specific kind of reader. I think the reader that you and I identify with is like the one who is deeply invested in a character and like sympathizes with them. I think a lot of the times I would pick up horror novels and find them lacking because of insufficient character work or character work that didn't ring true to me. And so when it comes to horror and my books going forward, I think are going to be scarier than Vampires of El Norte. I regret to inform my older sister who does not read horror but does read my books and harangues me like, why can't I write a non-scary story for once? I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's just gonna get worse for a little bit. I'm sorry. One day I will write a romance, but for now it's gonna be smoochies and spookies, as my mother says.
Tell me, what was, looking back on the writing process, did you have a particular, like, favorite scene or moment or just character in general from the
Yes.
book?
Yes. I mean, I love both Nana and Nestor. Nestor is special to me because he's such a softie, even though he's, like, very hard on the outside, and tries to and is quite macho. I think writing sensitive men who act macho
Oh, and
is
he's so wounded, Isabel. He's so
oh,
wounded.
it's delicious free. It's so fun to write. It's deeply indulgent, and it's so fun because when you're in their head as a reader and as a writer, you see that mismatch of exterior and interior and how much they're suffering on the inside. It's like, oh, so good. So I love him. He's the piece of the book that came to me first. So for that, he will always be special. I absolutely loved writing the scene where they see each other where they see one another for the first time after 9 years and they
Yeah.
realize, "Oh shit, they're here."
He is
Um,
freaking out. I was
it
with him. I
was
was like, "Oh gosh."
so fun to write. When my aunt read this book, she was texting me, she was like, "I'm at that scene, I'm at that scene," and I was like, "Ah, I'm so excited." Writing that scene, I read Susan Dennard's, she's a YA writer, I read her newsletter about craft, and I have for God, for years, like, maybe it's almost as long as she's had the newsletter, so, like, since 2014, 2015, ages, and she writes about how in every book, or even every chapter, or every scene, you need to have that like cookie. Like you need to be chasing the thing that you're like the real good stuff, the treat. And so for me, that was like a cookie scene. Like that was I was writing towards that. Like that was fun. Another scene that was super delightful to write was and that I'm very fond of was there is a point, no spoilers, where Nestor gets injured and Nana helps him. And I think writing that was just so fun.
Oh, yeah, I
Um,
love that scene.
she
Ooh.
it was big fun. I'm not gonna spoil anything, but, like, it's look forward to it, guys.
Yeah.
It's good.
I think
I love
my
it.
one of my cookies because we kind of know, Nestor's been he's been running and we get it. We get
Yeah,
it. It's very early in the book. But then there's this moment where they're back and is it Beto or Beto? How do you say it?
Peto, yeah.
Beto? Beto's
Yeah.
like basically like I know she's important to you because I've heard you like call her name in your sleep. And I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, oh god, our little
Yep,
wounded."
yep, yep. Like, in case you couldn't tell, I'm a big romance reader, and
This
we're gonna
big
go hard.
macho Nestor trying to, like, hide it and fake the funk, and Beto's like, "I'm on to you, bro." Like
I see right through you.
yes!
Ah,
Oh, that's so good.
I love writing characters like that because my sisters call me on my shit. Like I have, I'm a Scorpio. I have an exterior. I'm being actually quite vulnerable with you right now, and like I feel like we click, and so
It's 2
spill in the beans.
Scorpios, we feel it's the comfortability.
We just control each other. We just vibe. My husband is like, I don't believe in astrology, but I also don't not believe in
Yeah.
astrology. Because of Scorpios, period. It's like all of my best friends he's introduced me to are Scorpios. So I'm like, there is a theme here. I love writing characters who have a hard exterior and are like squishy on the inside. I think it creates a lot of it's interesting to write because I think as a reader, you're let in on all the secrets of what's actually going on inside, and what there's this great dramatic irony watching them move through the world and learn and change and learn to let people in, but also because it's my experience, like having a harder exterior, being I'm slow to trust, I'm slow to ironically for somebody who like pours their soul into a book and like hawks it on every street corner, it's like I am slow to share my feelings with people. And my sisters have called me out on that quite a lot. So writing the side character who sees right through them and calls them out. Oh, it's so fun. It's so
Yeah.
fun.
I mean, like, with the hard exterior, because I feel like Nana has hers as well,
Mhm.
but it goes back to what Abuela said, like, she's just hard because like, her best friend, her childhood love left her, and she had no idea why, but I feel
Yes.
like those cookies, when I started to feel like they're crumbling a little bit, was like, she asked him, like, "How many women have you been with?" And she's,
Mhm.
like, crushed, and he's, like, being honest, he's being honest with her, like, he's like, "I'll be honest with you," and she's so crushed about it because it's like, you went on and lived life without me, like, you left
Yeah.
me, and, it's so brutal, Isabel, but it's so good.
I don't know about you, but I am a big Taylor Swift fan, and I was trying to think about, like, what Taylor Swift song, like, works for this couple, because for the Hacienda, it's Wildest Dreams, um, for reasons. But for
Mhm.
this one, there's a song called Right Where You Left Me that's on the album Evermore, and it just occurred to me right now, it's like, yeah, because she was right there where he left her. Like, there
Yeah.
was she had to she was there and he was out there living a life, being a man, being free, and she was here, you
Yeah.
know, and
Yeah.
had to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward and find agency for herself. So she's a very angry person, and I think it's because I am too, but yeah, her grief is different from
Her
Nestor's, and
grief is different.
it speaks in different ways. He clams up, she lashes out.
Oh, yeah, she says it like her I think it's in her inner dialogue, it's around the scene that you shared, like, what is one of your
Yeah,
favorites. She's like, "I know that I can, like, hurt him with my words," or, like, "The best way to hurt him is with words," and she just,
yeah,
like, lashes out at him, and I'm like,
yeah.
"I'm the
She says
same
some
way, and this is wrong, but I'm the
I
same way."
know, like, words are very hurtful sometimes, and I think especially in romances, seeing characters realize they can hurt each other, and then grow past that and be compassionate towards one another is very powerful, because you see that shift in them, but also you see their weaknesses and their fault lines. And I think for Nena, it's like she does say some really hurtful shit, and Nestor says some hurtful things too. But I think in that, I think writing their dialogue and their arguments was like, I was chasing the words, like writing as fast as I could, because they were just going off in my head, back and forth. Like, um, their dialogue came very easily to me, because I think not only were they like fully realized little imaginary friends for me, but also they're very passionate people. And Nena especially, yeah, she can be very hurtful. I think I have been in the past too. So like, it's there's so much of every writer in every book that they write. But I think each book represents like a specific part of a writer. Um, the Hacienda represents specific parts of me, and Vampires of El Norte is my grief and rage book.
Earlier, we chatted about, when you went to the I think it was, like, the MFA program and, you and another student, the only students of color, and y'all were the only ones writing, like, genre fic.
Mhm.
As a writer now, you have these 2 books out that people love. Tell me the importance of genre fiction. Like,
I
how
think it's
how's I mean, obviously, your heart's always been in it, but if we could
yeah.
reach out to that professor, why does it matter?
Wow. First, I would give her a middle finger, because
Same.
rage. I'm an angry little gremlin. I Genre, especially in the times we live in, is a powerful tool for escapism. I think it its power to engage the imagination is also critical, because it takes us outside of ourselves. And you're a teacher. I've been an educator as well for college kids, and I'm hesitant to talk about my books as didactic. I think because there's an expectation, unfortunately, that I hate, placed on the shoulders of women of color or people of color who write historical fiction to, air quotes, teach the reader
Mhm.
about different periods or different people. And it's like, literature writ large takes readers on journeys. And I think what genre fiction does is it can tempt and tricked an otherwise reluctant reader, or somebody who's reluctant to read outside of their, air quotes, comfort zone, into a space where they encounter new people, new ideas, new voices, new ways of looking at the world. Like, I can't tell you how many Instagram posts I've been tagged in where people said, like, "Oh, horror's not my thing, but I wanted to read this book." Or, a lot of white readers who are like, I I do not read my Goodreads reviews. I'm certain there are reviews out there that say like, "Oh, I couldn't identify with these characters because they're not like me." Or like parentheses, white, because there's a lot of that floating around the internet. And I think what genre can do is take that reader on a journey and change them. I think fantasy and horror in particular, and romance being genres of escapism, provide safe places for people in trying times. Like, I am so passionate about genre, like horror in particular. I think really was a bedrock for my sanity during lockdown in early 2020. That's when I was finishing writing The Hacienda because the reading that I normally did, which is like high fantasy, was not providing enough escapism because I had all of this anxiety and it had, it fed, like it gorged itself on the things that were going on around me. I was living in New York City. It was very scary in April of 2020. And if I fed it a haunted house story instead, it it wasn't sated, but it was quieter. And I think that's horror is very powerful in that way. And when I was super anxious in the lead up to my book release and my PhD defense, which happened back to back, I read so much romance. I read so much romance. And I think that's why Vampires of El Norte is the book it is, because I read so much romance because it's a safe place. And I think that's why it's extra vital for publishers to put romances and other genre works by writers of color into the world because like we deserve our safe places too. Honestly, like more than the average white reader. We deserve those safe places where it ends happily.
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, it's scary, but
We need some
the person of
hope.
color doesn't always die first,
We
Maybe we all
deserve
die
some
at the
hope.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've never been somebody who was into literary fiction or realistic literary fiction. I think magical realism is as close as I will creep as a reader and a writer. That's just always been who I am. I think because being raised extremely Catholic, my world as a child and a young person was dominated by conversations of like the battle between good and evil, lightness and darkness, demons are real, exorcisms are real. Like I'm not making this up.
Oh,
Like
I went
my
to
dad,
Catholic school. I got you.
you get it, you get it. Like imagine that cranked up to 15 because my dad is an Opus Dei and I remember him calling me to give me a bit of a lecture when the Hacienda first
Oh
came
my
out because
gosh.
are real and we shouldn't be like misleading people. And I was like, sure, Jan. Okay. Like, don't worry. Oh, and witchcraft. Definitely, we got our chonies in a knot about witchcraft. But I think my childhood was my older sister pointed out, our childhood was like we lived in a speculative world,
Yeah.
being that Catholic, being raised aware of, forces that were larger than us and us being part of a greater battle between good and evil. Like, that's quite speculative when you think about it. It's like, is that not the underlying theme of every young adult fantasy novel that has ever been written?
Basically,
So
yeah. Yeah.
I was made for genre. I was formed for it from the very beginning.
You were, and you're here, and you're doing great, and I can't wait. I mean, I know you said you're working on things you can't tell us about. Is there
Unfortunately,
anything that you can like, what's next from you?
so I write short stories. I wrote a flash fiction piece called "There Are No Monsters" on Rancho Buena Vista, and it's set kind of like in a world adjacent or very similar to Vampires of El Norte, and it will be appearing in um, what is it? The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2023, edited by R.F. Kuang.
Oh, I love
Um,
those. Okay.
Yes, yes. So my short story was selected to be one of 10 fantasy stories that appears in this anthology, and I was going to, like, my last OB appointment when I got the email, and I, like, burst into tears in the car. Because this is, like I feel very, very, lucky that the Hacienda has found such a readership. My short stories definitely haven't, and that's cool, that's fine. They're more of, like, exercises and they're more experimental for me. They're very fun though. I have a list of them on my website, isabelcañas.com, but There Are No Monsters on Rancho Buena Vista will be appearing in October in that volume. I think it's October 26th. Yeah. So that's what's coming out next for me after Vampires of El Norte. And then after that, we have, keep an eye on my newsletter, sign up for it, keep an eye on my socials because I have such cool stuff to show you guys. Like, I'm frothing at the mouth about my new adult project. It's
Oh my
just
gosh.
Ugh, I cannot say more. I cannot say more, but I will say that my next projects coming up, emphasis on the plural there, are, um, insufferably gothic.
Oh my
Like,
gosh.
definitely play with the same, they're different stories. They are very different from the Hacienda and Vampires of El Norte, but they do play with Latin American history, they play with horror, and they play with heartbreak. So I think Do they have happy endings? I guess we'll have to see. We might be a
Do
little bit of
the thing, Isabel. Do the
yeah,
thing.
we'll
We will read it. We have to talk about them when they come out. I cannot wait.
yes, so that's what I've got going on.
Well, please plug all the places that we should be keeping up with you online.
So social media right now is an absolute garbage fire. I'm no longer on Twitter. You can find me in a variety of places because it seems like we're all trying to figure out what's next. Definitely Instagram, Isabel Cañas underscore. Threads, same handle. Um, Blue Sky is a thing, same handle. I don't know. Instagram is where you'll find me, and my newsletter, which is a tiny letter slash Isabel Cañas, and my website isabelcañas.com. That's where you can find me.